This time on Poll Hub, the U.S. invaded Venezuela, grabbed the president and his wife, and flew them to the Hudson Valley. On their way to an appearance in a Manhattan federal court on drugs and weapons charges, there is a lot to say about this, and a lot of people have been talking about it, but we're looking at past U.S. military actions in this hemisphere in particular to see how Americans back their presidents when similar moves have been made. Is it happening this time? Then, we start 2026 with CBS News transformed into a Fox News imitator and the Washington Post's editorial page, at least now, towing the MAGA line. And we're looking at new data about the state of the news media. Americans have rapidly lost trust in it and are rapidly turning to other sources to get information. For those that are even paying attention to news, we're going to talk about that. And finally, we're going to stick to it in our fun fact, literally. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub 2026. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Tommy Rogers.
And I am Lee Maringoff.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Hope 2026 is treating you well so far. This new year has brought a new political crisis. On January 3rd, the United States captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro. Now, historically, in the aftermath of situations like this, there tends to be a rally around the flag effect. But is that happening now in the aftermath of what has occurred with President Maduro? To answer that question, I think we first need to start with some recent poll numbers. And with that, take a look at the question of whether or not Americans approve of the U.S. sending military forces into Venezuela to capture Maduro. This was from a Washington Post poll that was conducted between January 3rd and January 4th, immediately following the capture. And here we're finding is that there really is no consensus on whether or not Americans approve on the military action. And there is, however, a great deal of a partisan divide, not surprisingly. So 40% of Americans, according to the Washington Post poll, approve of the using military forces to capture Maduro. 42% disapprove and 18% are unsure. Now, there is another poll out from YouGov, where we find that Americans are divided on the U.S. using military force to overthrow the Maduro government. 36% support military force in doing so and bring President Maduro and his wife to the United States to face trial. 39% oppose. And here, too, there is a significant proportion of Americans who are unsure. That is at 25%. When looking at whether or not Americans approve or disapprove of how President Trump is handling this situation, according to that YouGov poll, 46% disapprove of the way President Trump is handling the situation, 39% approve. And again, more than 1 in 10, 16% are not sure. But there is greater consensus on whether or not Americans think that perhaps Congress should have been involved in the decision. According to the Washington Post poll, 63% say that the operation should have required congressional approval. And taking it a step further to the future of Venezuela, 45% oppose the idea of the United States taking control of Venezuela and selecting a new government. And there is near unanimous agreement. 94% of Americans believe that the Venezuelan people should decide the country's future leadership. So, Lee, I want to open it up to you, coming back to that question about whether or not there is a rally around the flag effect here, given the numbers and given recent public opinion in the aftermath of the capture of Maduro. Is there, in fact, a rally around the flag effect?
Well, not evident from the numbers. In fact, a lot of people are staying on the sidelines, and then more, mostly Democrats and independents, not surprisingly, have a thumbs down towards the Trump action. And the Republicans, many of whom may be undecided, but clearly that's where the president is gaining whatever support he has. And look, I think it's a lot of factors explaining or contributing why he's not getting this, rally around the flag. And I think right off the bat his general approval rating is low. And I think that this policy it really wasn't set up. I mean, I think, in the numbers you talk about with should he go to Congress? Well, clearly they didn't even do it. They didn't even consult, as far as we know, with Congress. And, you don't need a congressional resolution necessarily, but you sure want to look like you're not doing it on your own. And that's also true for ally. If you think about other activities in the international arena during the Bush years and others, they, wanted to proudly proclaim that this was not a unilateral action by the United States, but we had an enormous number of allies supporting whatever we were into in Iraq or whatever. So I think that combined with his foreign policy seems somewhat episodic. In other words, we hear about Canada, we hear about Mexico,
I think that's generously.
we hear about Greenland, and now we're hearing about Cuba, and then we hear about Colombia. And so, what's the policy? I think he refers to it as the Donroe Doctrine, but I think that probably leaves a little bit to be desired in terms of convincing people. So, bottom line, no rally around the flag at this point. And, the idea that we're going to stay there for a long time and we might have boots on the ground. I mean, there's all kinds of things that just work against people saying, hey, great idea.
Jay, Lee brought up the idea that this was not expected. And when we look at history, does it seem to be that Americans are more likely to go along with the policy when it's expected, or is it more that there's we didn't see this coming, so I'm not going along with this until I know more?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And there are, as you mentioned, so there's historical precedents. So let's look at these. There's two in this hemisphere that I think are probably more analogous. One is Grenada in 1983. Ronald Reagan went in. He was not particularly popular in 1983. Remember, there was the economy was not in great shape. And we invaded Grenada, and we did it with some Caribbean nations. We weren't alone. There was a mixed message. This is probably the most analogous one. There was some mixed messaging about whether we were trying to save American medical students, whether we were trying to, save the hemisphere from communism because of the newly elected leader of Grenada. But at that time, after the invasion, which was a surprise, so there's no before and after, 58% of Americans supported the action. Panama, 1989, George Bush. We went in to take out the leader of Panama, who was brought back to the United States and charged on drug charges, right? So again, very similar. Before this happened, because there was a buildup to this in October 1989, UPI found 67% of Americans opposed the idea. So this is a really dramatic flip here. After the invasion, an LA Times poll found 75% approved the mission. So I think there's two things. There's also Iraq and there's some other ones, but these are two in this hemisphere. I think there's two things that stand out to me there. One, like Lee, as you suggested, if you state the reason and there's some support for it and it comes off successfully, I think there's a rally around the flag. And if you involve others. So after Panama, after Grenada, Democrats weren't thrilled with Grenada, but it wasn't like the entire House caucus of Democrats who ran the House at that point came out against that. Whether it was good or bad, there was a rally around the flag effect, I think, in that case, because of some of these predicates that had happened. Panama, another case where there were not others that were involved, but there had been a buildup. This guy's bad. We need to do something. We're going to do something. Again, it came off fairly successfully. I think the messaging here, there's been 5 different reasons given, and nobody gives the same reason twice. They can stand at the same news conference and give 3 different reasons. And that we landed on basically we're going to take all the oil and we're going to lower gas prices allegedly by doing that. I think that's going to keep there from being any rally around the flag effect in the long term here. This one just seems very different than past cases, not only in those ways, but I think it's very different from past cases. And I don't see how this one ends up reversing. I think also, is there partisanship here, Lee? I mean, is this purely just anything that this isn't a rally around the flag, this is a rally around Trump for Republicans. And that we didn't necessarily see that. There was not a huge bipartisan difference or partisan difference in Panama, even in Iraq. And then in Grenada, there was a little bit more. So I don't know.
It does help if we get attacked in some way. I mean, go back to Vietnam and with the Gulf of Tonkin. Who's going even further back? But that got a resolution from Congress, and the rest was history in terms of the U.S. policy in Southeast Asia.
But that was also war. We already had troops there, and we sent in troops and all that. This is like we went in and got the guy, flew him out, and it's not like I don't think anybody's talking about putting tens of thousands or thousands of troops in American fruit. In fact, the president said no American troops are going to be in Venezuela. So
also, I mean, I think the messaging and the rationale becomes diluted when we immediately go from the situation in Venezuela to the idea of buying or taking over, or as the White House has said, no options are off the table when it comes to Greenland. So, I mean, we're going from, okay, we're going to remove the president of Venezuela, but now we're going to go to a different part of the world, and now we're going to buy Greenland. And so the reasoning to some becomes questioned as to why exactly are we doing this when we're just going to go from one region in the world to another region of the world and take over. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well.
How much of this is a distraction, Lee, though, from...
Well, the critics will say, does the name Epstein ring a bell? And maybe I can sort of delay what may be the inevitable at some point, I guess. We're going to find out some things that maybe the president doesn't want to be headlined. So yeah, but I don't think in the long term, I mean, the policy has to stand on its own merits. And for a president who I think would have portrayed himself more as an isolationist in terms of borders around our country, and we're not going to get involved in regime change. This is the kind of things that when people stop and reflect, they're not going to be thrilled with in terms of delivering on what his campaign promises were. And the economy then gets into that also. So there's a lot of things that's very unmanageable from the White House's perspective. And basically, you got to say you're going to do it, and then you do it, and then you pop the champagne that you've done it. And anything other than that seems to be, as you say, a distraction or something that involves other countries which we did not know we were necessarily opposed to, like Greenland. I mean, that's not Cuba on the radar screen.
Well, Lee, before we move on, I did want to ask you a question about polling, because this is a podcast about polling. And we take a look at the Washington Post poll, which was done in the immediate aftermath of the capture. Is there a danger in going into the field and collecting public opinion so close to an event? Or what's the benefit, and perhaps what might be the downfall? Or the pitfalls
recognize that when you do get something, while the event is sort of very much in its first act, you are going to get a sense of, an initial reaction. And let's not think that American public opinion is well formed at that point. That's why these undecided numbers are so great. And if it wasn't a Donald Trump policy, but just more in an abstract, I mean, the numbers would have been, do you support going into this country for the following? Well, then people would even have been more uncertain about what the policy was or whether they had an opinion. So the polls are okay, but we get back to snapshots, and these are snapshots and they're initial, and they do have to be understood in the context of a broader sense of who Donald Trump is and what he's doing. And if you're in Trump's corner, then, as I think Jay alluded to, he does no harm, nothing wrong. But if you're not, you have a way of kind of dividing up what your policy preferences are by what Donald Trump is doing. So you're for him or you're against him, and that helps form public opinion, because it may just be him, not necessarily Maduro or the particulars of what's going on in Venezuela, not even necessarily the oil. I mean, people don't necessarily think we're going there to get the oil. Maybe this is the drug cartel stuff. I mean, there's so much, as we've been talking about, that is, floating around this policy that's very hard to pin it down. And so if you want informed public opinion, you probably aren't going to get it while the paint is still wet. So to be continued, maybe unfortunately to be continued, but we're getting a lot of saber rattling out of the White House and Defense Department in lots of places where we did not know we didn't like people. And so, that's a harder sell in the long run.
Well, speaking of news events, and this is the beginning of the year, we have this giant news event. If you think about some of these past things that we had talked about, Iraq or Grenada or Panama, round-the-clock coverage on TV networks and then in the newspapers. This is how we learned about what happened in these prior events. Mm-hmm. That's not what happened this week. And part of that is the changing nature of the media and news. We've talked a lot about this on this show over the last 7 or 8 years. We've had a lot of segments about this. But we wanted to bring this back again because there's really kind of an acceleration, not just in how people are getting news. We talked 6-7 years ago about how, so many people are getting their news from Facebook. Actually, that's not true. I mean, that's in the decline. Social media as a place to get news is somewhat declining along with the mainstream. What's really interesting is how people, especially younger generations, aren't even getting information and news from institutions. They're getting it from influencers or individual people. And that is new, and that is different. So a couple of pieces of data, and then we'll talk about this. Tommy Rogers on with us, our producer, who is, are you 21 or 22? You're 21, right?
I'm 21. Yeah.
21. Okay. So you're going to represent your generation in this.
Can
Congratulations.
we edit that out of the program? I just
You were 21 once, Lee, and nobody would edit you out when you were 21. We're not editing Tommy out. So a Gallup poll from October of last year found that 28% of adults now say they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in newspapers, television, and radio, kind of mainstream media. It is a new low. Trust has fallen along party lines, but it's in the single digits among Republicans. And other polling that's been done over the years, Republicans don't see Fox News as mainstream media. So there's also this division between trust in national and local outlets. Pew, in an October 2025 study, so a few months ago, found 56% of adults say they have at least some trust in national news organizations. That's down sharply from 2016, but 70% still express at least some trust in local news. And finally, this thing we were talking about with generational differences. Younger adults have been dumping traditional media for years. This isn't just, like we talked about Facebook or anything like that. But Pew's recent reporting finds a sharp rise in young people getting news from social platforms and creators as opposed to social media. For example, the use of TikTok for news among people under 30 has surged. This cohort is more likely, under 30, to get their news from YouTube, TikTok, and influencers than from legacy TV or newspapers. What does this mean for our shared conversation, our shared understanding? And I think this is actually a really good example of what we just have gone through, right? This invasion or kidnapping or extraction or whatever you want to call it of Maduro. How did different people get that information, and how does that form their opinions? I mean, so Mary, you've done this for a long time. You've talked to students about this kind of stuff for a long time. And you've been working in classes, and as we all work with students over a couple of decades now, right? How does this impact, do you think, how we understand kind of the shared narrative of what's going on?
I think what we've learned from students throughout the years has been that, yes, there has been this evolution from traditional media to different types of media. But what I think is becoming more and more apparent is that we've now moved from, as you've pointed out, the idea of younger people, younger Americans, getting their news from apps that are from traditional news outlets to other and more fragmented sources. And so I think what happens here is that it feeds the debate among not just students and their peers, but also among other generations. It gives us a newer and new perspective to the conflicts and to the stories that are out there. And I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. I think that it allows for what you and I have talked about in many different conversations, which has been going back and hearkening back to journalism from its earliest days. So the idea of objectivity in journalism is really something, a product of the 20th century. But but prior to that time, there was this clash of ideas in the earliest days of our nation. And so I think what we are seeing is we're seeing that the narrative is up for debate to a large extent. I think that plays into our politics. I think that journalism in the industry or lack thereof, if you would go to that extent, really is a reflection of what we're experiencing politically. And so I think it has a great opportunity for us to democratize, as it has been one argument as electronic journalism has developed and has evolved over the last 20 or so years. But I do think that there are some challenges to this as well because of the technology and the speed of the technology itself. I know, Jay, you talked to the idea that generations are getting their news from people as opposed to institutions, and I would agree with you there. I don't think that necessarily that is completely new, because when you think of celebrities weighing in on current events and different types of conflicts, I mean, that's something that has been occurring. But what I think that is new is that the technology brings the information forward for debate much more quickly. And so almost to the extent where it becomes almost impossible to fact check and to sort of create an opinion that is not just a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah. Interesting on the fact check, because if things are, we don't have a news cycle. We have this constant bombardment of news and follow the bouncing ball. And I think that does change it. It changes the equation in terms of the timeline on everything. And so every day, every hour, every few minutes, you can have a different point of discussion. What seems to result from that is, I think, two things. One, we don't really get a common viewpoint formed over time, which may have been better suited to the old models of TV news, where the nation would get down around the dining room table or living room and watch the people like Huntley Brinkley and Walter Cronkite. This is obviously a long, long time ago. So there's that aspect of it. I think also the bombardment of news and this constant, changing of the information, I think, has created somewhat of a little fatigue out there. I mean, I think, I can understand better why some people are turning off to the process, because they just have other things to deal with in their lives, and politics may be just kind of like more of the same for them. And I think Donald Trump, to some degree, is guilty of that, at least in terms of having up the flow dramatically of social media and just what's coming out of Washington.
So Lee, it's not just politics news that people are tuning out. And Tommy, I'm coming to you, so be ready. Multiple polls have shown falling interest in news among young Americans. The most recent from Pew showed 36%, not young Americans, I'm sorry, Americans. The most recent from December Pew poll, so just last month, 36% of Americans say they follow news most or all of the time. That is down from 51% in 2016. And you'll recall on a show that we had about a month and a half ago, Global Strategy Group found a difference between passive news consumers and active news consumers, and found that about 4 in 10 Americans are passive news consumers. If it comes to them, they get it. They don't go looking for it. And that kind of changes everything about how people understand the world. I want to ask you, Tommy, about this, like getting news or information, like news information from influencers or individuals as opposed to institutions. Why is that something that especially people under 45 and under 30 are so attracted to, as opposed to, going to the New York Times app or the Fox News app?
I think that a lot of people when they like an influencer, they'll listen to everything they say. So like if they have a political opinion or like a certain viewpoint, they're going to be able to like just kind of copy and paste their view and not actually make an opinion of their own.
Do you follow? I mean, do you have people that you follow? You don't have to name them, that's fine, but
I do have people, and I won't name them, but I think that almost all my views, whatever they say, is what I'm going to say. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I should form my own opinions, but it's just kind of the way it is right now. I think that a lot of younger adults agree with me on that one too, that if someone says something, that they like.
So historically, I mean, yes, historically, Lee, like that's what Walter Cronkite was, right? In the beginning of the television news age. And historically, as you mentioned, Mary, news in America prior to the printing press in the late 1800s was basically all one-sided, one side or the other. And the earliest ones are pamphlets from people like Thomas Paine or Paul Revere or whatever. They were personal. They were, here's my view. So have we just come full circle? Is that all this is?
Yeah, I thought that. Yes, I gave him his line on the British are coming. It worked. It was very effective. I think we are to some degree coming full circle because we've gone through a period where the news has attempted to be objective. People didn't buy that necessarily. And we've now moved from that into a period of cable, which was a lot of opinion, and now social media in different forms. But I think, maybe I'm just very traditional, but I mean, I do like to some degree the filtering effect that the journalists provide from the experience that they have, from knowing some of these people they follow. I mean, I don't mind at all having a White House press corps. Now, people don't necessarily like that because they've been attacked, and increasingly so. And that's not just Donald Trump. I mean, people have tried to manage the news for a long time in one way or another. So, yeah, but I like at least to have a filter effect, so I'm not relying just on the influencers. Although, you pay attention, you keep score whether the folks you like are sort of on your side of this. So,
right,
I see that.
The same, right, but isn't that the same thing? I mean, Tommy, isn't that when the people that you trust, it's because you decided to trust them, they've done things or said things that you built trust. Is that really any different from Lee or me, our generation of trusting between the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the ABC, NBC, CBS? We're going to get the picture from them as a collection.
Yeah, like, I mean, you just think about the previous things that they said in the past, and like, you know what they believe, like their ideals is what you believe in. So it's just kind of the same thing. So, I mean, if you trust a specific institution, like in the past, it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Tommy, I'm just curious, do you feel, because thinking back to the historical piece of this, it almost seems like our times, for lack of a better term, there's such a lack of civility, and that is different than previous centuries even. Do you feel that your generation is open to considering the other viewpoint, or do you feel that there's this idea of a closed-mindedness around the other side to an argument or debate?
I think that if you have one side, nothing's going to make you change that side. So, like, I don't know, if you're like a Trump supporter, nothing's going to make you support someone else. Like, it's just, that's just the way it is right now. I think that, like, people have a very strong opinion about either side, and there's no in between.
So I guess the question really is this change in journalism fostering debate, or is it fostering a division between the two sides?
Or vice versa, all the way around. and those things are driving the changes, eh? Hard to say.
Well, at the risk of getting pulled down for a pun, shifting gears a little bit. We're now going to talk about automobiles. Well, you wanted to shift also. Now I'm shifting gears.
Yeah, I liked it. I think it was good.
Double
Yeah.
button,
I mean, I thought
okay.
that was a clutch play right there.
Or a slip on my part. Clutches will slip, I think. Anyway, enough. Okay, so we have...
We're losing listeners by the second.
98. Everybody knows what's coming. What a suspense. 1978, way back when, a household survey was done, which we found from the Roper Center at Cornell University. The question being asked was basically, after an introduction, do you ever drive a car with a manual transmission or not? The national survey of 2001 Americans. And at that point, going back to the 70s, 73% said yes, 26% said no, 1% said they don't know. That kind of concerns me, but that's a whole different matter. How does this car work anyway? Well, let me just pull this lever and see what happens. But here you have the overwhelming majority say they have. And I know for myself that my father did train me to drive and instructed me, and I learned on a manual transmission, because he always said if there's some kind of emergency and you have a car and the car only has a stick shift manual transmission, you want to be able to get in and drive. Nowadays, maybe not so much. So let's go around the circle here and find your experience. I'm going to start with Jay and Mary on the manual transmission first. And have you ever driven a car with that? I think, Jay, I know you have. I think. Yep.
I have one. The only cars I've ever had. The only cars I've ever owned, other than an SUV, which are kind of second cars, have always been manuals. And I learned to drive in a manual. My mom, when she could ditch the station wagon, kids were out of the house, she was like, I'm done. She got a manual. Her next 2 cars were manuals. And so I learned to drive and drove on those. My first 3 cars that I bought for myself were manuals. I then lived in New York for 20 whatever years without a car. And then in the upstate here, I currently drive a manual transmission. Yes. I'm team stick.
You're stuck on it.
Once. I've driven a manual once. So all of my cars have been automatic. My husband's quote unquote toy car is a stick shift, and I do not drive that car. And I think that's part of his plan.
What's his toy car? Wait. What is his toy car?
It's an early 90s Corvette that is in the driveway.
So. That's not a toy. Well, that's a guy toy.
It's a guy toy, exactly.
Transmission is a learning process, and it's a little harder, I think, than just pressing drive or whatever. So let's go to, I think I know the answer to this. Do the current students know even what we're talking about? Tommy.
So yeah, I never met anyone that, drove manual until I met Sylvia. I was a student producer from last year. She drives manual, and I was just really surprised. And then we talked about it, Jay and I talked about it the other day, about how he drives manual. So what about you guys? Cassie, have you ever drove manual?
No, I have not, but I also barely drive at all. So I don't think I'm wrong for this.
Have you ever been in a manual car where somebody was rolling the gears? Okay.
I was going to ask, does Chris drive a manual?
No, he doesn't. He loves to go into sports mode, but not manual.
I'm shocked by that.
Molly.
I have not, and I actually haven't been in a vehicle
where someone is driving manual, and I'm not too confident in myself to one day try.
Well, you have to, it's an art. It's a learning curve. There's no doubt about it. You don't want to burn out 3 clutches on the way to learning. Hey, Jay, what do you got? Yeah. And are you part of the, what are we talking about crowd?
I have the same answer as Cassidy because I barely drive. And no, I've never driven manual. I feel pretty confident in saying that I never will.
Yeah. I remember taking my driver's test on the manual, and I think I passed the test because I downshifted from third to second and showed that I knew how to control the car as I was going up an incline, even though I hit the curb on my parallel park. Okay, so that I thought that was an automatic failure, and the driving instructor or driving whatever just said, no, keep going, because I think he'd already made up his mind that I could control the car, which was probably a little problematic. But Jay, what were you just saying?
Yeah, so 2 things. One, part of the reason that the 4 of you are like manual a lot is that fewer than 1% of the cars sold in America now are manuals. And 2, I think you're right, Molly, that you'll never drive a manual. Not because of that. You'll probably never drive an automatic transmission in 10 years because electric cars don't have transmissions. And as we eventually move, almost certainly we'll probably at some point in your lives, almost all cars on the road will be manual, or will be, electrics. There's no transmission at all. So there won't even be an automatic transmission. But I will put in this one thing that I love about stories about manual transmissions. There's lots of them, but my favorite is probably apocryphal. I'm sure it's happened, and I can't give you a specific example, but the carjacking that is stalled by the person who jumps and get out of your car, I'm stealing your car, and they get in behind the wheel, and it's like they don't know how to drive a manual, and it's a manual. That's why I tell people I drive a manual. It's not the truth, but I think it's a good story, so I stick with it.
Yeah. Why did the market shift so much, though? I mean, it's not just technology. It's so very different.
Really?
Yeah, that was an accident. I didn't see that one coming. But what's the driving force behind this?
So manuals... Right. Manuals, the really made shift in the 80s. There were still 30% of the cars in America were sold with manuals. Right. And I think part of it is that automatics became more efficient. Remember, manuals back in the gas crisis in the 70s, you'd get a diesel or a manual because better gas mileage, sometimes significantly better gas mileage. Automatics became much more sophisticated. And when makers like Porsche or even Ferrari put automatics in, or they're a different kind of automatic. They're the kind that are used in Formula One racing and stuff. But when those start going into cars and enthusiasts are driving those, I think that kind of paved the way for the demise of the manual. Again, there are still ones you can buy, but not for probably very much longer.
Now then, one of my skills will be done. I'll have to cancel. I haven't driven a manual in a long time. Jay, maybe I'll take yours around for a spin and see if I can burn out the clutch.
Sure. Give it a try.
I started with my father, not to throw my mother under the bus, as it were, but my father used to tease that my mother it was the only person who carried spare clutches in their trunk. because you can really burn it out if you ride the clutch, as it were. So I've taken care of both of my parents, but then again, we're talking about manual transmissions, and so that fits. But anyway, that brings us to a grinding halt of today's podcast, and Happy New Year, folks. I hope it's a good, healthy one for everybody, and we'll catch up with you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers, Cassie Connors, Sylvia Weiser, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you.
We'll see you next time.